I'm here representing not only Northern Water, but a coalition of partners that have been really quite involved in the post-fire recovery over the last year since the East Troublesome fire. We had initially envisioned this presentation as a panel with some folks from Grand County, but unfortunately they were not available to join me today. So I'm all you get, but please know that the things I'm going to be talking about here, they're really on behalf of a group of folks that have been really involved and very dedicated to this process. So I'm the Environmental Services Division Director at Northern Water, and I've been there since 1999. And in that capacity, I've been providing oversight to the post-fire recovery process, especially with the focus on the watershed restoration aspects on behalf of Northern Water. And I'm going to start sharing my screen. Let's see. Oh, would you allow the screen sharing, please? Okay, can you see my slides? Okay, very good. Thank you so much. So I'm going to share our story about how wildfires are impacting water management in the Western U.S. It is a rapidly evolving story with many twists and turns, and one that presents many challenges to people like us water providers and local governments who are used to planning in an organized and structured manner. And responding to a crisis like this involves a little bit different management style. I'm going to talk about what happened in November of 2020, why it matters, how we have organized our wildfire recovery response, how we are advocating for resources towards this effort, and the challenges we are facing right now. A little bit about Northern Water, if you're not familiar with us. We are a Conservancy district, a quasi-governmental agency in charge of cooperating and co-managing the federally owned Colorado Big Thompson project. This project is owned by the Bureau of Reclamation in the United States. And we also manage other large existing and future water development projects to ensure the water supply needs of the Northern Colorado Front Range. The Colorado Big Thompson project, CBT as we call it, is supplemental in nature and serves raw water to municipal, agricultural, and industrial users over a 1.5 million acre service area in Northern Colorado. And we supply water to over 600,000 irrigated acres and are the drinking water source for over 1 million people. Our project includes 12 reservoirs, well over 100 miles of tunnels and canals, and 700 miles of transmission lines. The water that is brought over to the Front Range generates electricity as it makes its way from the headwaters of the Colorado River to the Northern Colorado Front Range. And this is a map that shows the system, the water collection system on the west slope, and then the distribution system on the east slope. We are a trans-mountain diverter, and our geographic reach is quite broad, extending from all the way down to the Utah state line on the west side to the Nebraska state line on the east side. The CBT project straddles the Continental Divide and moves water from the headwaters of the Colorado River to northeastern Colorado via a 13-mile long tunnel that traverses Rocky Mountain National Park. Our service area on the map is shown in beige, and the 2020 wildfires, and that includes both the East Troublesome fire and the Cameron Peak fire, affected both sides of our infrastructure and the watersheds that are tied to this infrastructure. I won't talk much about the Cameron Peak fire on the other side of the divide, but long story short, our focus in terms of post-fire recovery has been primarily on the East Troublesome fire, and I'll explain why in a second, because although the Cameron Peak fire was actually a larger fire than the East Troublesome fire by a little bit, because of the where it burned in the watersheds, we have better abilities to bypass impacts from the fire, whereas on the East Troublesome fire, we really just don't. It's upstream of our infrastructure, and what's going to come down is going to come down directly in our system, and there's not a lot of options to bypass it. This chart is a compilation of the 10 largest wildfires in the recorded history of Colorado, along with the more recent mega fires of 2020. It is pretty obvious on it that these mega fires have all occurred since 2002, and they are becoming increasingly large and devastating. I mean, we thought we had a really large fire with Heman and then with Hyde Park Fire in 2012, and then the fires that occurred last year dwarfed these previously large fires. And these fires are also occurring outside of the typical fire season. The East Troublesome burn in October and November. Under a warming climate, unfortunately, we can expect that these trends will continue and that wildfires are going to be increasingly present in our landscapes and part of a future we need to reckon with. So let's look at the East Troublesome fire. This is a picture of the Kawanichi Valley on the west side of Rocky Mountain National Park in the headwaters of the Colorado River. And this picture was taken a day or two after the major fire run that occurred on October 22nd of 2020. It looks more like a picture of Mordor. This map here shows how the fire spread. It traveled 20 miles the night of October 22nd, burning over 100,000 acres during that, over that one run. Much of that growth happened over a 90-minute period of time. And that night, the fire was pushed by hurricane force winds. Almost 600 structures were burned in the fire. 4,000 residents were evacuated in really an emergency situation because nobody had anticipated that the fire would spread so quickly and so far. At the end of the burn, the fire scorched 193,000 acres, spanning 37 miles west to east. And most of the burn scar is of high and moderate severity. The different colors that you see within the burn area indicate the soil burn severity. These results, this map should be taken with a little bit of a grain of salt because the mapping that was done for the soil burn severity happened in November, and there was snow on the ground. There was a snow event that helped put out the fire. And so it made it a little bit more difficult to evaluate the conditions on the ground since there was snow cover. So there's a lot of the modeling and assessments, and I'll talk about that in a second, are actually all of them are heavily reliant on this map of soil burn severity. And there are a number of entities that after a fire come in and do run assessments to try to figure out what are the risks post-fire in terms of flood and water quality and debris flow, sedimentation, and it's all derived from this soil burn severity map. So yeah, I've already mentioned that 100,000 acres burned overnight on October 22nd, and the fire made a run of 17 miles in a short period of time. Something else that is notable about this fire is that 90% of the burn occurred on federal lands. And this is of importance when you're talking about post-fire recovery, because the programs, the federal recovery programs, such as the NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service Emergency Watershed Protection Program, only provide funding for watershed restoration on private lands. There's a little bit of a nexus with Forest Service land, but it's limited, and really the focus of it is on private lands. And in this instance, the private lands represent only about 19,000 acres of the whole burn area, which is just about 10%. And roughly 70% of the burn is on Forest Service land. So why do we care? A number of reasons. I mean, from Northern Water's perspective, 57% of the drinking water supply of over 1 million people will suffer from post-fire impacts. Critical watersheds are almost completely burned. If you kind of make your way around the Three Lakes system area, around Granby, Grand Lake, and Shadow Mountain Reservoir, you can see on this graph, on this map, the percentage of each watershed that was burnt by the fire. In the case of Willow Creek, with the Willow Creek watershed, just downstream of Granby Reservoir, 88% of the watershed is burned. Stillwater Creek, that flows in directly into Granby, 90% of that watershed is burned. So overall, when you look at the amount of water that flows from these various watersheds around this system, 57% of that water, of that volume of water, is going to be affected by post-fire runoff. And that includes things like sedimentation that will fill in rivers and storage vessels as well, ditch diversion structures, and it may render all of this infrastructure, which there's quite a bit of in this part of the watersheds, difficult to operate or sometimes inoperable. Snowmelt and rain runoff on bare soils loosen the hill slopes and can cause devastating erosion, sedimentation, debris flows, and flash floods. And these impacts can last 5 to 10 years, sometimes even more. There will be degradation in water quality, and that can include things like harmful algae blooms that in some instances can produce toxins, increased concentrations of various compounds that can be difficult to treat. And we already know, we've heard that from some of our water users, that they're expecting some potential violations of public health water quality standards. There's certain compounds that get very elevated after a fire, like organic carbon concentrations, and they can be really difficult to treat and cause an increase in the risk of occurrence of disinfection byproducts, which are tightly regulated due to their carcinogenic risks. And when water can be treated, it is usually with higher costs and greater use of chemicals. And what I'm describing here, that's from Northern's perspective, we're certainly concerned with it as it pertains to our water users on the East Slope, but the same issues are relevant as well for the municipal water supplies within Grant County as well. This slide here describes in a simplified manner generally the two big programs that are available for post-fire recovery. And one is more focused on federal lands, the other one is more focused on private lands. Both seek to apply treatments to stabilize soil, protect fish, wildlife, and archaeological sites, prevent destruction of ecosystems, control the movement of water where we know there's going to be more than there was before, sediment and debris, and mitigate threats to life and property, and to the downstream values at risk that will be affected by these post-fire impacts. I'm going to zoom in a little bit more on the Emergency Watershed Protection Program, because it is the program that is really available for local organizations to implement watershed restoration. And as I mentioned earlier, it is really focused on private property. So it leaves a big gap in terms of watershed restoration on federal lands. The federal lands, in this instance for this fire, they're managed by the Forest Service, the Rocky Mountain National Park and BLM. They have their own post-fire process, but they will do some amount of watershed restoration. However, and it's a big however, it is really focused on protecting their own values at risk from the agency's perspective. So it might be things like trailheads and removing trees that are hazardous to folks that are going to be recreating on the trails. It might be fixing parking lots or visitor centers, things like that. They're not, they don't have the resources, are not focused on providing treatments that are going to protect downstream values, infrastructures, properties, water systems, et cetera. So this program from the NRCS, the Emergency Watershed Protection Program, is focused on emergency mitigation of watershed impairments that threaten life and property on private lands. And there's a little bit of a nexus, as I mentioned, with the Forest Service. In some instances that allows a little bit of work there, but it's limited. And it starts with teams of experts that perform assessments. They're called a damage survey report. And these reports identify at a fairly high level what the restoration needs are. They're then submitted to the NRCS for approval and funding, and they're administered by a local sponsor. It's a very heavy lift to manage this program, especially for a fire the size of the East Troublesome. And it places a lot of responsibilities on the local sponsor to manage this program and implement and work with the landowners and implement the watershed restoration. And it also requires that this local sponsor brings match funding to the program to supplement the 75% federal cost share. So NRCS will only pay 75% of the total watershed restoration costs, which, as we'll talk about in a minute, is a big deal when you're talking about restoration on a fire this big. We're talking about millions and millions of dollars. So upon investigating the WP program, and due to the magnitude of the burn, it quickly became apparent that no single entity could support this work, and that a successful watershed restoration effort would require extensive collaboration between a number of entities. So as a result, the EWP sponsorship for the fire was split between Northern Water and Greene County. And Northern Water covers the restoration work in the watersheds associated with the CBT and Windy Gap project, which is highlighted in yellow on the map. And Greene County is responsible for the remainder of the burning area around downstream in light teal on the map. We knew that this program would require an all hands on deck approach and heavy reliance on critical partners. So beyond Northern and Greene County, we also joined forces with other partners, 3 other partners, the Three Lakes Watershed Association, the Middle Park Conservation District, and the River District. And we all entered into a memorandum of understanding and agreement that allows that kind of formalizes our rules of engagement and also allows for input from local stakeholders and from the community to inform decisions made by the sponsors and the EWP partners. And we felt it was especially important because we were going to be doing work on private lands. So as I described, this partnership is between five entities. It is a voluntary collaborative framework. Nobody forced us to do that. We had no obligation to enter it into this agreement. We did it as in a spirit of collaboration and to really leverage our respective strengths and resources and make sure that we were as efficient in our recovery effort as possible. All right, so what do we do? What kind of work do you do under this program? You can do, it includes a variety of treatments such as aerial seeding, mulching, erosion controls, sediment basins, debris removals, and flood protection measures. And I'll talk about it. I'll talk about it in a little bit more detail, show you some pictures of some of the types of projects that are involved. The EWP process it follows a pretty regimented schedule. It started with a request for assistance that was made towards the end of December. And once you make that request, it starts a clock of 60 days to complete assessment and field surveys. So it was a real challenge to do this because it was in the middle of the winter. Obviously, there was snow on the ground. And at the same time, we felt really pressed to really get things going before snow melt and monsoonal rains that are about to come now in the next few weeks. So it was a real challenge and balancing act between trying to make decisions and plan and advance the process with a whole lot of uncertainty, incomplete information, difficult assessment conditions, and still, trying to get valid enough information to advance the process. So we did the field work in February, and the field work was then compiled into these assessment reports sent to the NRCS. And the assessments showed that there was a need for $35 million worth of work, and that request was sent to NRCS for review. They approved the request in its entirety on March 26th, and that started a new clock, for project implementation. The big challenge here is that funding availability limitations have led to an initial allocation of only 12 million out of the 35 million that were requested, and then there's another technical assistance allocation of 2.4 million that was made as well. That's for design and additional assessments. So we entered Northern and in Grand County entered into an agreement with the NRCS mid-April, which officially kicked off the implementation of the EWP program and the identified projects. We've already received an extension of the initial deadline that was associated with the 220 days. So we're now looking at March 2022 as the goal for completion of the projects. But again, we only have $12 million out of the $35 million that are needed, and 25% of the total cost of construction needs to be raised by the sponsors. Oops. Okay, so if you look at the assessments that were done, and there was a plethora of assessments that were performed by different agencies. We received projections of multipliers for snowmelt runoff, because when you have burnt watersheds, you have less vegetation or no vegetation left, whether it's tree canopy or on ground cover on the watershed to intercept the water, the snowmelt or rain that then moves through the watershed, and so the resulting effect is that you have more water that will come down through the channels downstream. And that's a combination of the lack of vegetation, but also in some instances where you have high severity burn, the soil, it can be so hot during the fire that it can transform the soil properties and turn the soil into some almost plastic layer that really no longer absorb water and just makes it run off as if it were on a sheet of plastic. So hence the increased risk of flooding. So we've got maps that show here places where there were anticipation of significant increases in snowmelt runoff, debris flows, sediment transport, and flooding. And it was really challenging to bring all of these modeling results together into a cohesive and digestible platform to help us make decision out of the 19,000 acres of private land. Where do we need to prioritize our work and implement projects? And this is an example of some of the outputs we received. Here we're showing both snowmelt and storm events. When we're saying storm events, we're talking about rain events, and how it is expected that the flows at certain points in the rivers will be multiplied as a result of the fire. And you can see here that we were looking at an increase of between 1.5 to 1.1, in terms of snowmelt flows. And for fairly frequent, 5-year return frequency storm events, the multiplier there for the peak flow associated with these events is somewhere between 1.5 to 3 times the amount of water that we would have seen before the fire. This graph here is a compilation of a literature review that was done by Rust and others, and it shows in a very general way, based on a lot of different fires seen in the Western US, typically how much of a water quality concentration you see depending on the constituents. And you can see that for turbidity, so it's how much material there might be in the water, how cloudy the water is, and it can multiply all the way 25 times the baseline concentrations before a fire. And typically you'll also see significant increases in nutrients. So it's showing here nitrates and nitrites at the top, as well as total phosphorus right here. And you can see multipliers here that are at least 5 or 6 times the baseline concentration. And it's important to remember, especially when we talk about nutrients, that we're talking about high mountain systems here that typically are fairly low in nutrient concentrations. And so big changes changes in concentrations of this magnitude can really upset the system and cause some strong water quality responses. So we'll see. We haven't seen it yet. We haven't gone through a season yet, but we're expecting that we're going to see some degradation in water quality. So in terms of treatment, so what does it look like? Erosion reduction, we're talking about things like aerial seeding or mulching. This picture you see in the middle, mastication with heavy mashing that basically just eat up the trees and turn it into mulch. It can be straw bales that are set up on steep hill slopes along gullies to try to capture, and slow down the movement of sediments, or tree felling for the same purpose in a certain direction, and directional tree felling so that it's perpendicular to the slope and it can slow down flows and also retain some of the sediments, keep it on the hill. Sediment debris and control, it can be things like sediment basins, it can be debris booms. If you live in the area, you're going to see debris booms being installed on Willow Creek Reservoir and on Grant Lake. Some of these are in the process of being installed, and they're intended to protect infrastructure and try to make it easier to collect these debris and remove them from places where they're going to cause issues. It can be road and bridge protection treatments, armoring of the banks, and flood protection, including alert systems that give a notification to downstream users and property owners that water might be coming down. Flood barrier bags, and we're not talking your Home Depot sandbags. We're talking about 4x4 cubes of sand that can be stacked up all the way up to 8 feet tall, that essentially are like a mini dam, to protect structures from flooding. So we spend quite a bit of time trying to figure out, especially since we don't have a full funding allocation, how do we need to sequence the projects, in terms of what is really most critical to protect, since we don't have all the money right away. And also it's a huge amount of work to do. And so it's not possible to do it all at once. So we sequenced the project implementation as follows, with an emphasis on the projects first that provided a greatest regional benefit versus a more local benefit. Those that were more time sensitive as it related to pre-runoff versus monsoon season, and also readiness, what was ripe in terms of certainty of analysis. There are some areas where there's really a need to do more refined engineering and technical analysis. And so we brought it all together into this sequencing scheme that I'm showing here. And we've started with the implementation of emergency warning system. That's on the way. The removal of debris that, before we have some advance, to keep channels, unobstructed, and remove the chances of backup water and flooding. Debris booms, these are being installed, as I mentioned. And then the next big operation is going to be seeding and mulching applications, which are expected to start for implementation mid-June. So these are really the top projects that we're working on right now. And as we get more funding, we'll start making our way down the list. So recovery funding, this has been one of the big hurdles in implementing the projects, because as I mentioned, we only received $12 million out of the $35 million that are needed. And again, this is only for 10% of the watershed. There's another 90% of the watershed on federal lands that also needs urgent watershed mitigation. And there's very limited funding to do the work. This EWP program that we're using right now with the NRCS to do the work on private property has been depleted. And it's at the end of its cycle. Unfortunately, it is not regularly replenished through annual appropriations, federal appropriations. It only gets replenished through supplemental appropriations, either via an infrastructure bill or a disaster recovery bill. And we don't have anything right now on the table that such bills that would bring new funding into the EWP fund. So right now the fund is pretty much dry, and until it gets replenished, we're not going to see more funding. And we're also trying to deal with raising match funding, because 25% of these costs have to be covered by local sponsors. So when you're talking about $35 million, that's a big chunk of change. So we've been working with the state to try to get some help from them, and have the Colorado Water Conservation Board bring dollars to the table to help the local sponsors match the federal program. As I mentioned, 90% of the burn remains to be treated, and we're also trying to advocate for a greater use of the EWP program to do treatment on Forest Service lands. There's a nexus with Forest Service lands in that program, which has not been leveraged enough, and could funnel more dollars if they were available towards doing some work on federal lands as well. And we're coordinating pretty closely between the East Troublesome fire and the Cameron Peak fires. They're struggling with similar things, and so we're there's force in numbers, so we've been trying to unify our messaging and get some attentions from our Colorado delegation, which we have gotten. We've had visits with Senator Bennett on the East Troublesome fire. I believe Joe Neguse was in Grand Lake yesterday. And we've also had some meetings that included West Slope folks on the Cameron Peak fire. And then we had everybody there. We had Ag Secretary Vilsack, alongside our governor, our two senators, and Representative Neguse. So a lot of political eyes on this process right now. A great part of the story is the collaboration that's taking place, and not only between the EWP partners, but the many entities that have a presence in these watersheds. And this is a list of the 40 plus agencies that have been meeting every 2 weeks to talk and coordinate the recovery process. And within these 40 agencies, that we have over 150 staff that have pitched in and sat in these conversations and participated. So it's a great story of collaboration. I hope that it will also eventually tell a great story of success, but we're still in the thick of it. So we have created a web platform for folks locally to access updated information about the recovery process. It is a standalone website that is neither on the Grand County website nor on the Northern Water website. It's a standalone platform, but it's on behalf of all the partners involved in the restoration, and there's a lot of information on there. I encourage you to check it out if you're curious. And we're continuing to build it. And eventually we're going to start putting some information about the project status and where we are with implementation of these projects. And for folks that live in each of these areas, they can connect with their local sponsor, either Grand County or Northern Water, through these 2 email addresses. And I will end here and turn it over for questions or comments. Hi, Kathy.
I'm Kathy Finland. I have a question. Was it correct that the 42 million, it was allocated, but there wasn't the money, or is it?
Yes.
So what does Joe Nagoose and what do they all say about that?
We asked for $35 million. That's through the EWP program, and we've gotten 12 so far.
Right.
And our Colorado delegation is very supportive of, getting behind any funding, process that will help get monies back into the fund. So they're very supportive, very engaged. How quickly that's going to happen, that's the question. And my sense is that it is unlikely that we'll see new dollars in the EWP fund this fiscal year, federal fiscal year. So that's worrisome. We keep hammering that same message. It's urgent, urgent, urgent. And we're going to get to a point where we will have spent the $12 million, and then we're going to have to really think about, well, what do we do now? It's a real challenge. It's not a position we want to be in. We've been hammering, nonstop the same messaging about the urgency of this funding, and I think there's going to be a gap between when we run out of the funds and when we see some replenishing of the EWP funding, unfortunately.
Yeah, and so the replenishing comes from the new infrastructure bill, or?
I'm not aware of anything in the new infrastructure bill. It probably would have to be a disaster recovery bill. And so that's going to be the task of our delegation, is to gather some momentum and find some sponsors to bring a bill to the table.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to talk to them about that, because Hickenlooper Bennett, Joe Nagoose.
The more voices.
We have really good players there, and they are smart and they know what we're talking about. And it's, Grand County and the impacts of East Troublesome are a little farther away from everybody's eyes than the Estes Park, what happened in Estes Park. And so we don't want to become invisible and not get funding for that reason. So I'm on it. I'll do my best.
The more voices, the better.
Do we have any other questions for Esther?
Yeah, Dan Phillips here. I just heard a rumor that Granby was deliberately going to be kept low and act as a settlement pond for a lot of the runoff. And that's something that I've heard from a couple different sources, but again, it's just rumor. None of these are legitimate sources as far as government entities. But, and I know you mentioned that, what you had as far as the booms and stuff like that, but they're essentially, there's a rumor out there that they're going to use Lake Granby as a settlement pond to stop a lot of the contamination coming from the runoff from the fires from going downstream. I don't know if you can in a position to address that.
I'm not aware of any special operations for Granby Reservoir. I am aware of some slight changes in operation of Willow Creek Reservoir to keep the water levels there lower, because there are some concerns about being able to absorb higher flows, during the rain events. And making sure that we don't overtop the dam. So I think they're going to be operating at kind of the lower end of the standard operating protocols that reclamation usually utilizes for Willow Creek, but I'm not aware of anything for Granby.
Okay, that makes sense because Granby very rarely spills to begin with. So, I mean, over the top.
And I don't believe we're expecting a spill this year. I mean, it is the largest bucket, in the system, and it is the one that is going to have the best ability to absorb, sediment impacts, that from the watershed. But I'm not aware of any special operations right now.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? All right. Well, thank you very much to everyone for joining, and especially to Esther. I feel like that was so interesting and very informative. And speaking for all of us, I'm sure we all learned something. So thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.
One more thing for Headwaters. I saw that initially that you recorded this. Is that recording going to be available to share?
Yes, it is.
And what would be the best way to access that?
So let me, if you could send an email to info@headwaterscenter.com, we'll add you to our lists, and then we just send that out to everybody afterwards for the people that missed it.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. All righty. Well, thank you. Everyone enjoy your afternoon.
This was great. Thank you.
Yeah, especially thank you to Esther.
Really good job. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good rest of the day.
I learned a
Thank
lot.
you.
Thank you.